The wind had a way of carrying secrets across the open land, brushing through the fields and rattling against the old wooden fences as though it remembered lives long gone. Out on the ridge, where the soil cracked under the weight of too many summers and winters, a man stood in silence, with only the sound of his own breath to remind him he was still alive. Clay's hands were calloused, rough with years of work, yet there was an emptiness in his grip, as though he had been holding on to something that had already slipped away. The farm was quiet, too quiet for a man who once knew laughter in these rooms, warmth in these halls. Grief had not left him bitter, but it had left him hollow. For 3 years he had moved like the seasons, predictable, steady, unnoticed. Work fed the body, but nothing healed the soul. The small wooden house bore its scars just as he did. The porch creaked with every step, the roof groaned in the wind, and the garden that once bloomed with his wife's tender care now stood tired and faded. He walked those paths each morning, not because he expected change, but because habit was easier than hope. Sometimes he wondered if the silence was his punishment or his shelter. Nights were the worst. When the fire died down and the shadows pressed too close, he would close his eyes and remember her voice, soft as rain, calling his name from somewhere he could never reach again. Healing felt impossible, like a word made for other men, not for him. And yet, even in his solitude, the land demanded life. The chickens still clucked for feed, the fences still needed mending, the earth still called to be turned. He gave it his strength, though inside he felt withered. The townsfolk knew him as the man who came only when he had to, boots heavy with dust, hat low, eyes unwilling to meet theirs for too long. They spoke of him in half-whispers, pitying him, but never offering more than a nod. He didn't mind. He had stopped looking for kindness, but fate often hides in the ordinary. The road into town was meant only for supplies that day. A sack of flour, nails for the fence, oil for the lamp. He expected nothing more than brief exchanges, the weight of coins against wood, and the ride back home. He didn't know that the path he followed would carry him into something far greater, something that would reach into his silence and set it trembling. The air itself seemed to thicken as he guided his horse down the familiar road, the sun slanting gold across the bare cottonwoods. He had no idea his life was about to be split open, no idea that love, unexpected and raw, was waiting in the shape of a woman he had never met. Loneliness had taught him to stop asking for miracles. He did not pray for them. He did not expect them. But sometimes the world moves without your consent, placing before you what you thought you could no longer bear to touch. A chance, a choice, a fragile beginning. That afternoon in town, as shadows stretched across the dirt street and the blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance, his eyes caught a figure that made his breath pause. At first, he thought she was like the rest of the town's forgotten burdens, someone left behind, someone cast aside. But the longer he looked, the more he felt it. Something more than pity. Something more than obligation. A spark buried under ash. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know her voice. But her presence cut through the haze of his grief like the first warmth of spring pressing against the frost. The farmer who had lived like a ghost found his gaze locked on someone who stood with the strength of the earth itself, though chains still hung from her wrist. She was not trembling. She was not begging. She was simply there, eyes dark, unyielding, as if daring the world to either claim her or set her free. Clay had spent years burying his heart beneath the soil of memory, but in that moment something shifted. A seed stirred. A story began. And though neither of them could see it clearly yet, love, slow, healing, inevitable, was already moving toward them, steady as the tide. If you feel the weight of this story settling in your heart, if the quiet ache of loneliness and the promise of healing touch you in some way, let your soul speak. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, subscribe so you can walk with this journey until its end. Even the smallest gesture, like the smallest seed, can grow into something beautiful when tended with care. And as the farmer turned from the blacksmith's fire toward the shadowed corral, the story slipped forward, step by step, into the place where love was waiting to be found. The first sight of her never left his mind. She stood apart from the world as though the town itself had abandoned her to the mercy of the wind and the weight of curious eyes. Behind the wooden gate of the corral, she was caged but not bound, watched but not touched, displayed yet unseen. The rope across the post made her no less human, yet to the townsfolk she was little more than a question they did not care to answer. Her wrists bore swollen marks where iron had once held her. Her ankles were bare, skin dusted and bruised from roads she had walked without rest. And yet, even in the ruin of her dress, in the tangles of her black hair, in the dried blood at her lip, there was dignity. She carried herself as though the shame belonged not to her, but to those who looked away. Clay's breath slowed as he studied her, though his heart beat harder than it had in years. He had seen grief before, had worn it in his own bones, but the strength in her silence unsettled him. She held a stone in her hand, small, grey, unremarkable, and clutched it with the intensity of someone clinging to the last fragment of home. She did not shiver in the cold. She did not plead for water. She did not break her stare when his eyes met hers. That look, unwavering, carried more words than any tongue could shape. I have lost everything, yet I remain. He asked the men standing nearby why she was still there, and their careless answers struck him harder than any blow. She was unclaimed, they said. She did not speak their language. She belonged to no one. If no one stepped forward, she would be sent away, eastward into the kind of life that devoured both body and soul. She was a ledger entry, a burden of cost, nothing more. And yet here she stood, breathing, alive, her chin raised as though she would not allow them the satisfaction of seeing her bend. Clay felt the words rise from somewhere deep within him before he knew what they meant. How much? The men blinked at him, surprised, almost amused, as though they doubted he could be serious. But his hand moved already to his coin pouch, the weight of silver heavy in his palm. His wife's ring still lay hidden in a drawer at home, but here, in this moment, his heart chose something without his permission. He paid for her freedom, not out of charity, not from guilt, but from an instinct older than reason. The need to bring her out of the cold, away from the stairs, out from behind the rope that reduced her to property. The gate creaked open. The chain at her wrist rattled, soft but sharp enough to cut through the market noise. She did not flinch, did not thank him, did not even shift her expression. Yet, when he told her low that she could walk on her own, she stepped forward, one bare foot after the other, like a queen walking from ashes. She climbed into the wagon without hesitation, her stone still in her hand, her gaze steady. On the road out of Ash Ridge, the air carried the howl of coyotes and the fading voices of men who had already forgotten her name. Clay guided the horse with his hands, but his thoughts lingered on the weight of her silence. Behind him, she sat upright, breathing calm, her presence pressing against the space like a new heartbeat in a long-abandoned house. He built a fire that night, laid blankets on the ground, and handed her bread and water. She ate slowly, never lifting her eyes, her shoulders upright even when the torn fabric of her dress revealed what she had lost. She took his coat when he offered it, not as a beggar accepting pity, but as a warrior conserving strength. He did not touch her. He only watched the light of the flames move across her face, and realized that for the first time in years, the silence of night did not feel empty. She slept with her back to the fire, a stone in one hand, her other arm curled beneath her head. Clay sat awake, watching the rise and fall of her breath, listening to the crackle of embers that seemed to echo the rhythm of her chest. Grief had kept him company for too long, and now here was another soul carrying scars heavier than his own, lying in the glow of his fire. Healing was not something either of them had sought, yet the first thread of it stretched invisibly between them as the night deepened. When dawn touched the sky, they rode on. Neither looked back to the town, for there was nothing left to return to. The land opened wide before them, hills and pine ridges waiting like old companions. Clay's home came into view, a house that smelled of dust and sorrow, a barn with doors weathered and weak, a yard too quiet. He tied his horse, stepped down, and opened the door. She followed, her bare feet scratching against the ground, her eyes scanning every corner, every window, every escape. He spoke gently, telling her she could sit, telling her there was food. She said nothing until the taste of salt touched her tongue, and then her voice, low, steady, broke the silence with a single word. That word struck him like the toll of a bell. It was not gratitude, not plea, but proof that her spirit was still alive beneath the silence. She was not broken. She was simply waiting for a place where her voice could rise without being stolen. Clay watched her eat, and in that moment, the table that had stood barren for 3 long years became whole again. The night that followed carried no storms, no interruptions, only the soft sound of her shifting in sleep. Clay sat in the chair beside the stove, eyes on the dim glow of the coals, and felt something stir that he had not allowed himself in years. The warmth of presence. Not love yet, not healing yet, but the beginning of both, woven quietly in the dark. And as the days began to unfold, as work called him to the fences and the fields, as her quiet strength began to weave itself into the rhythms of his land, the story of their bond deepened. Trust was not offered in words, but in silence, in shared labor, in the way her eyes met his without fear. Each moment drew them closer to something neither had expected, something neither had dared to imagine. A love born not from rescue, but from choosing, day by day, to remain. The days that followed stretched long and slow, marked by the rhythm of labor and the careful balance of 2 souls learning how to share the same silence. Clay rose early, as he always had, the weight of his boots steady against the frozen soil, the cold air filling his lungs with the sharp reminder that winter was not finished with them yet. But now, when he opened the door to greet the morning, he felt the difference before his eyes found it. She was there. She had stayed. She moved with quiet grace, her bare feet pressing against the wooden floorboards, as though she feared leaving any trace behind. She sat near the stove, hands clasped, eyes watchful, but never desperate. She ate what was given, worked with what she could, and never asked more than what was offered. Yet the smallness of her voice, when she first spoke in single words, salt, water, bread, felt like openings in the earth where seeds might take root. They were fragile, yes, but alive. Clay watched her when he thought she did not see. The way her shoulders curved forward when she wrapped herself in the old quilt, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of her bowl before she set it down, the way her eyes wandered to the door, always alert, always measuring the distance. He had lived with silence long enough to know its many kinds. Silence that comforted, silence that punished, silence that healed. Her silence was all three at once. It was a shield she carried, but it was also the thread by which she anchored herself to the world. He did not try to break it. He only sat across from her at meals, worked the land with her watching from the fence, built fires with her presence near enough to feel, though not near enough to touch. And slowly, the silence between them softened. It was no longer the emptiness of two strangers, but the quiet of two people learning to breathe in rhythm. One afternoon, while repairing the chicken coop, Clay asked her to hold a loose board steady. He expected hesitation, perhaps refusal, but she crouched without a word and gripped the wood with sure fingers. Her hands bore cracks at the knuckles, small cuts that spoke of older wounds, but she did not flinch. The bruises along her side, dark as the memory of violence, caught his eye as she bent, and his jaw tightened with a quiet anger he did not voice. He told her he could fetch something for the pain, and when she allowed it, he left the jar on the table without touching her. She applied the salve herself, the scent of pine and roots rising in the air, and for the first time she spoke of her past. "The army took my brothers," she said softly, not looking at him. "I was hiding. They found me a day later." Her wrist lifted slightly, the scars from iron still visible against her skin. "I'm not going back." Clay's voice was low, steady. "You won't." She looked at him then, really looked, as if testing whether his words carried weight or were only smoke. Whatever she saw in his face was enough, for she nodded once and said no more. But that night, when she laid her quilt across the floor, her breathing came easier, and when sleep caught her, her body did not twist so restlessly. The next day, she joined him at the woodpile. At first her swings with the axe were clumsy, too wide, too hurried, but he handed her gloves and said nothing. She learned quickly, finding the rhythm, letting the weight of the blade do the work. Sweat beaded along her temple, her dress clinging where the torn seam revealed more than modesty would allow. Clay saw, and though he turned his eyes away, the image lingered in him like heat from a dying fire. She was beautiful, not because of her shape alone, but because of the resilience that pulsed through her every movement. That evening, when they sat at the table, she reached for the vegetables without waiting to be asked. She cut them slowly, carefully, and stirred the pot while he watched from across the room. It was a simple act, but it carried weight. It meant she had chosen to stand beside him, even if only for a moment, even if only to flavor a stew. And as the scent of onions and broth filled the air, Clay felt something inside him loosen, a knot he had carried since Sarah's passing. The memory of his wife did not fade, but it no longer pressed against him with the same unbearable weight. For the first time, the house was not haunted. It was lived in. Later that night, as she lay on her quilt, he noticed she turned onto her back for the first time. Her hands still held the stone, but her chest rose with an ease he had not yet seen. Trust, small and tentative, had entered the room. It was not spoken, not declared, but it was there, alive in the air between them. 2 days later, a storm swept across the ridge without warning. The wind howled against the shutters, snow lashed at the windows, and the roof groaned under the weight. Clay braced the doors, cursed the gaps in the wood, and stoked the fire high. When she asked for clothes, he led her to the back closet, where Sarah's things still lay folded and untouched. He stepped aside, letting her choose without intrusion, and when she emerged in a dark skirt and cotton blouse, the sight startled him. The torn dress was gone, replaced by something whole, something hers. The fabric framed her shoulders modestly, covering what had been unwillingly exposed, and yet she carried it with the same unshaken dignity. "Better?" he asked, voice gruff. She nodded. "Warm." They spent the day inside, the snow muffling the world, the fire the only sound. She sewed the shawl she had carried, her fingers steady, while he shaved in the kitchen basin, catching her reflection in the glass. At one point, her eyes lifted and met his in the mirror. Neither looked away. That night, as the storm rattled the windows, she pulled her chair closer to the fire. Clay sat beside her, rubbing the ache in his leg where an old fall still haunted him. She noticed, her gaze steady, and without speaking, she reached out. Her hand brushed his as she steadied a shifting log in the flames. It was not an accident. It was deliberate, warm, healing. He froze, and so did she, but then her palm settled fully over his. The world seemed to still. Clay turned his hand slightly, enough for his fingers to brush hers. The moment stretched long, alive with unspoken truths. Then she withdrew, but the warmth remained. When she lay down to sleep that night, she did not turn to the wall. She lay on her back, eyes closed, breathing steady, while Clay sat by the fire with his hands remembering the touch of hers. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone in his own home. The silence was no longer hollow. It was shared, healing, alive. And as the snow began to melt and the fields softened for planting, their lives settled into a rhythm that neither of them had expected. She worked beside him, carried water, hammered nails, bent over the soil with dirt under her fingernails. He found himself watching not just the tasks, but the way her hair caught the light, the way her shoulders squared with pride when she struck true, the way her silence now held less weight, more peace. Love was not spoken yet. It did not need to be. It was growing in the space between glances, in the brush of hands, in the warmth of evenings by the fire. And when the first blossoms appeared at the edge of the fence, stubborn yellow flowers pushing through the thawing ground, Clay understood. Healing had come not with noise or miracles, but with the quiet decision of two wounded souls to remain. From that soil, deeper roots would come. The snow melted in slow surrender, pulling back from the ridges and fields, leaving behind soil damp with memory. Spring came not as a rush, but as a steady breath of thaw, a gentle unfolding. Clay noticed it first in the small things, the drip of water from the eaves, the softened earth beneath his boots, the way the hens began laying again after months of silence. Yet the greatest change was not in the land, but in the quiet companionship that had taken root between them. She no longer hovered at the doorway, as though uncertain of her place. Instead, She stepped into each room with a steady calm, her shoulders less tense, her eyes softer. She no longer clutched the stone at all hours. Sometimes she left it on the table, as though trust itself had begun to take its place. She wore Sarah's old clothes, washed them by hand in the basin, and made them her own, not as a thief of memory, but as someone giving old fabric a second life. The house breathed differently now. 2 mugs by the stove, 2 sets of boots by the door, the table no longer lopsided with emptiness. Clay found himself listening for her footsteps, the faint rhythm of her movements across the wooden floorboards. At dawn, when he woke, he sometimes heard the sound of water being poured into the basin, or the low scrape of wood against metal as she sharpened a knife for the day's work. It was strange how quickly a man could grow used to another presence after so many years of solitude. Strange, too, how the silence he had once worn like a shield now felt lighter, softer, as though it had been mended with threads of her breath. They began to work side by side in the fields. She bent over the soil with quiet determination, her fingers pressing seeds into the ground as though each one carried the weight of survival. He showed her how to tie branches into trellises, how to repair the fences with nails driven deep into cedar posts. She learned fast, watching his hands, repeating each motion until it became her own. At midday, they sat beneath the cottonwood, sharing water from the same canteen. Sometimes their eyes met, and neither looked away. In those moments, the warmth of the sun seemed to echo inside them, a healing that had nothing to do with the weather. It was in small touches that trust revealed itself. A brush of her hand against his when she passed him the axe, the steadying grip she gave when he stumbled slightly on his bad leg. The way he placed a second blanket near her bed without words, and the way she accepted it without protest. These were not grand gestures, not declarations of love, but they carried more weight than vows shouted to the sky. They were choices, simple, quiet choices, to stay, to share, to heal. One evening, as the fire burned low, she carved symbols into the porch rail with the tip of a knife. When Clay saw them the next morning, he did not ask what they meant. 2 shapes, rough but steady, one like a mountain, the other like a flame. He knew without words that they were part of her story, part of the world she had lost, but still carried inside. Later that day, he carved his own mark beneath hers, not initials, not a name, just a line cut deep into the wood. When she saw it, she touched it gently, then touched his hand, not briefly, but with the weight of acknowledgement. Something passed between them then, something that did not need speaking. We are both marked now, together. It was not without trials. One morning, hooves echoed down the road, and 3 riders appeared at the fence. They carried authority in their stance, their boots polished, their eyes sharp. They asked for her, claimed she was still listed as property, demanded her return. Clay stood with rifle in hand, shoulders squared, his voice flat as he told them no. She stepped onto the porch beside him, bare feet on the boards, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her voice, steady and clear, carried across the yard. "I am not going with you." The tension cracked in the air, but the riders turned away, unwilling to test his words. When they were gone, she sat on the porch steps, her hands trembling for the first time. "They will come back," she whispered. Clay crouched before her, his hand hovering near hers, but not yet touching. "I'll be ready," he said. She studied him for a long time, as if weighing the truth of it, and then nodded. That night, when she laid her quilt across the floor, she placed it closer to his chair by the stove. From that moment, something shifted. She began to trust not just the walls of the house, but the strength of his presence beside her. She began to believe that safety could exist, not in hiding, but in choosing where to stand. And he, who had thought himself long buried under the ashes of grief, began to realize that love was not a single flame, but a slow, healing fire built over time, each spark fed by the courage of two broken souls refusing to be undone. Spring deepened. The fields turned green, the chickens clucked with life, the air warmed enough to open windows. Clay found himself pausing at times to simply watch her, her hair catching the sun as she bent over the garden, the curve of her waist as she lifted a basket, the steady rhythm of her hands hanging laundry across the line. She caught him watching once, and instead of looking away, she held his gaze. That silent exchange spoke louder than any confession. I see you, and I do not turn from it. That evening, as the stars appeared, she sat beside him on the porch. I used to think staying alive was only surviving, she said quietly, her eyes on the horizon. But now, I think it's something else. He turned toward her, his face lined with the softness of dusk. What is it? She pressed her hand against her chest. Choosing to belong, even when it hurts. He did not answer, but he reached out slowly, his fingers brushing hers. She did not pull away. Her hand turned, lacing with his, firm and deliberate. And for the first time, neither of them looked to the shadows of the past. They looked only at the fireflies rising from the grass, the soft glow of life continuing, the healing that had already begun to take root in the soil of their shared silence. And as the night deepened, they both understood. Whatever storms might come, whatever eyes might judge, they were no longer walking alone. They had chosen each other, and that choice was enough to carry them into whatever came next. The air turned softer as spring ripened into early summer, and with it the land awakened in full measure. Green rose pushed through the soil, tender shoots stretching toward the sky as though the earth itself remembered how to hope. Clay walked those rows with steady steps, boots pressing into the damp ground. But what drew his eyes was not only the crops, it was her. She knelt in the soil, hair falling loose across her shoulders, fingers stained with earth as she pressed seedlings into neat lines. She worked with care, not haste, her movements carrying the weight of someone who understood that even the smallest seed held a future if given patience. Clay paused at the fence, watching her quietly. There was strength in the curve of her back, determination in the rhythm of her hands. Yet there was something gentler, too, something healing. The way she tilted her head to listen to the wind, the way she touched each plant as if it were alive long before it grew. She no longer looked over her shoulder as often. She no longer gripped the stone with white knuckles. The sharp edges of survival had softened into something steadier, something almost like peace. When she rose, brushing soil from her skirt, she caught his gaze. She did not look away. She lifted her chin slightly, as if to say, "Yes, I am here. I am part of this place now." The moment lingered, filling him with a quiet warmth that reached deeper than words. He turned back to his work, but the thought remained with him that the land was not the only thing being healed. The rhythm of their days carried them like a slow river. In the mornings, she drew water from the pump, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, droplets clinging to her skin. Clay would bring her kindling for the fire, setting it down without needing to speak. They moved around each other in a harmony unplanned but natural, as though their bodies had already learned the pattern of belonging. At midday they ate in the shade, simple bread, beans, water from a tin cup. And though few words were spoken, the silence was no longer heavy. It had become the silence of trust, the silence of two souls breathing in rhythm. Sometimes at dusk, she lingered by the porch, eyes on the horizon, as though listening for voices carried on the wind. Once, when he asked if she missed the place she came from, she said nothing for a long while. Then, softly, "Every day." Her voice held no bitterness, only the weight of remembering. Clay did not press her with questions. He only stood beside her, his presence steady, a quiet offering of comfort. She did not move closer, but she did not step away. Healing was not a sudden blaze. It was the slow warmth of embers that refused to die. One night, as the sky burned orange and purple over the ridge, they shared a meal on the porch. She leaned back against the beam, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her knees pulled close. "Are you afraid of dying?" she asked suddenly, her eyes steady on the fading light. Clay considered the question, the ache of old grief stirring in his chest. "I wasn't," he answered. "Not until I lost her. Then I was." His gaze turned to hers. "Now, I'm not hiding, but I'm not chasing it either." She studied him in silence, then whispered, "I'm still hiding." He wanted to tell her she didn't have to, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he let the truth rest in the air between them. She looked down at her hands, clenched tight in her lap, and after a long moment she reached out, just enough for her fingers to brush his. It was not an accident, not a passing touch. It was deliberate. He turned his hand slightly, letting her palm settle into his, their fingers curling together. Neither spoke, but the world shifted. The crickets sang in the grass, the wind carried the scent of earth, and two souls, scarred by loss, discovered the healing that comes from a single touch. From that night onward, she did not guard her distance as fiercely. When they cleared brush behind the barn, she stumbled on a root and caught herself against his arm. But instead of letting go quickly, she left her hand there a moment longer than needed. Her eyes met his, unwavering, and though no words passed, both of them felt the pulse of something undeniable. That evening she carved more shapes into the porch rail, lines crossing like rivers, a mountain, a flame. Clay saw them at dawn, his hand tracing the grooves, and beneath them he carved his own mark. She found it, touched it, and then, without hesitation, laid her hand over his. Life began to take on new color. She laughed once, low and soft, at a hen chasing after a beetle across the yard. The sound startled him, for it had been years since laughter filled this land. He didn't speak of it, but he carried the sound with him all day like a hidden flame. At night, when the fire burned low, he listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing and realized that the house no longer echoed with emptiness. It was alive again. The turning point came when 3 riders appeared at the fence one morning. Their leader, dressed in polished boots and a pressed coat, claimed her as property, demanded her return. Clay stood firm, rifle in hand, his voice steady. "She's not going anywhere." She stepped out onto the porch beside him, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her feet bare against the wood. Her voice cut through the air with clarity. "I'm not going with you." The men hesitated, measured the weight of her resolve, then turned their horses away. After they left, she sat on the steps, her hands trembling. "They'll come back," she whispered. Clay lowered himself beside her, his hand hovering near hers, his voice low. "Then I'll be ready." She turned to him, eyes searching his face, and whatever she found there made her shoulders ease. That night, when she spread her quilt by the stove, she laid it closer to his chair, and when sleep took her, her breathing was steady, unbroken by dreams. From then on, the bond between them deepened. She began to look at him differently, not with caution, but with recognition. He noticed it in the way her gaze lingered when he worked the soil, in the way her voice softened when she asked for simple things, in the way she touched his hand without fear. And he, in turn, found himself listening for her laughter, watching for her smile, waiting for the warmth of her presence. The land was no longer only his burden, it was their life, shared and healing. And as the summer stretched wide beneath the endless sky, both of them knew, without saying it aloud, that what had begun in silence was slowly, steadily becoming love. A love that did not erase the past, but carried it, wove it, healed it, until the pain no longer defined them. It was no longer about survival, it was about choosing each other day after day in the quiet strength of belonging. The days grew long, the sun climbing higher with each morning, pouring gold across the hills and settling deep into the soil they worked side by side. By then the rhythm of their lives had taken root, each hour braided into the next, like threads in a quiet tapestry. Clay rose before dawn, the air still cool and heavy with mist, and found her already awake, her shawl wrapped tight across her shoulders as she watched the eastern sky pale with light. She no longer stood apart as though testing the world for danger. She waited beside him, silent but steady, her presence as natural as breath. The house had changed. Where once the walls carried only echoes, they now carried her touch. Herbs hung drying above the sink. A strip of cloth, woven by her hands, stretched across the window frame, catching the morning light with threads of color. The small bedroom that had long been locked, filled with tools and dust, was cleared now, her space. She did not ask for it, did not claim it aloud, but she swept the floor, folded the quilt, placed the stone she had carried for so long on the windowsill, as though it belonged there. Clay had not known how much he needed these small signs of life until he saw them, and he found himself watching her quiet work with a tenderness that both comforted and unsettled him. In the fields, their labor moved in rhythm. He drove the shovel into the earth, arms taut, shoulders low, while she followed behind, her hands pulling weeds, setting seeds into the dark soil, smoothing the rows with precision. Sweat beaded along her brow, dirt streaked her cheek, yet she moved with the grace of someone who had finally found purpose again. She did not flinch when the sun burned or when blisters formed on her palms. She only pressed forward. Sometimes, as she bent over her work, her blouse shifted, revealing the curve of her collarbone or the soft rise of her chest, and Clay felt his breath catch, though he forced his eyes back to the soil. But even when he turned away, the warmth lingered inside him. At midday they rested by the cottonwood tree, water shared from a tin cup, the earth warm beneath them. She would close her eyes, lean her head back, and listen to the wind. Once she spoke of her brothers, her voice low but steady. She told him how they had walked the ridges, naming the valleys from memory, how their laughter used to echo through the canyons. "Every day I miss them," she said, her hands twisting lightly in her lap. Clay did not answer with words. He simply handed her the canteen. She drank, then passed it back, and in the silence that followed, something healing passed between them, a quiet honoring of the dead and of the living who carried them. The nights brought their own changes. She no longer slept by the stove. Instead, she lay in the small room at the back of the house, though the door often remained cracked, as though she wanted the sound of his breathing near. He, in turn, found himself listening for her, not out of worry, but out of habit, comforted by the rhythm of her rest. Sometimes, in the dark hours, she stirred, whispering words in her own tongue, her body tense with dreams. Clay did not wake her, did not intrude, but he sat by the dying fire until her breathing steadied again. The act was silent, unseen, yet it anchored them both. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, she asked suddenly, "Did you love her?" Her eyes were clear, unflinching. Clay's chest tightened. He looked toward the porch, where dusk pressed its shadows across the fields, and finally said, "Yes, I did." She nodded slowly. "Do you still?" He swallowed hard. "I don't think love goes away. It changes. It becomes something quieter, like an echo." She traced the rim of her mug with one finger, then whispered, "I don't want to take her place." He turned to her then, his gaze steady. "You haven't. You couldn't. But you've given me something I thought I'd never have again." Her breath caught, and for a long moment she did not move. Then, slowly, she reached forward, her hand brushing his. He turned his palm upward, letting her fingers curl into his. The touch was deliberate, warm, healing. When she finally lifted her eyes to his, there was no fear in them, only quiet fire. He leaned forward, his hand rising to touch her cheek, and she did not turn away. Their lips met with the weight of something earned, not taken, slow, steady, filled with the ache of years lost and the fragile hope of years yet to come. That night she rested against him by the fire, her head tucked beneath his chin, her body curled into his side. His arm wrapped around her shoulders, not as a shield, not out of duty, but out of choice. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was whole. Healing. Days turned into weeks, and the bond deepened in ways both subtle and profound. When they walked through the town for supplies, she no longer shrank behind him. She walked beside him, her steps even, her eyes unyielding. Whispers followed them, stares cut sharp. But Clay's hand rested lightly at the curve of her back, and she stood tall. At one stall, a man muttered something crude, and Clay stepped forward, his voice flat. "She's my woman." The words hung heavy, final, undeniable. She turned her face to him, her eyes glistening with something fierce and tender. Later, as they rode home, she laced her fingers through his, and this time she did not let go until they reached the farm. One evening, She stood on the porch with the red cloth her kin had given her, tying it to the railing with deliberate care. Clay watched her in silence. When she turned, she said softly, "It's not to say goodbye. It's to say I remember." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Then I'll remember with you." She touched his hand, and in that gesture the past and present braided together, no longer at war, but at peace. That night, as the fire crackled, she leaned into him once more, her breath warm against his chest. "We're not rescuing each other," she whispered. He pressed his lips to her hair. "No, we're choosing to stay." And in the quiet of that truth, the house, the land, and their scarred hearts all felt renewed. The fields outside stretched wide beneath the stars, rows planted with hope, rows watered by sweat and silence. And within the walls of the farmhouse, two souls scarred by loss had found what neither dared believe they would know again. Love, born from patience, bound by trust, and healed by the gentle courage of choosing each other. And as dawn crept once more over the horizon, their story turned its face toward the future, waiting for the next chapter of their life to unfold. The heat of summer settled over the land, heavy and unrelenting, yet life carried on with quiet persistence. The fields stretched wide with green, each row of corn rising taller, beans curling upward along trellises, squash leaves spreading broad as shields. Sweat clung to Clay's collar each morning, and his boots kicked dust that seemed never to rest. But he worked with steadiness, for now he was not alone. She moved beside him, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, her skirts brushing the earth as she bent low to weed or water. There was no hesitation in her hands, no trace of reluctance, only determination, as if every seed placed in the soil was a vow to remain. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in gold, they sat side by side on the porch steps, drinking from tin cups filled with cool well water. Her laughter came rarely, but when it did, like the time a chicken startled itself chasing a grasshopper, it rippled through the air with a brightness that startled him more than thunder. He held on to that sound, stored it deep, for it reminded him that even the heaviest grief could soften into something healing when given space. Yet not all days passed in peace. The world beyond their land still carried suspicion and cruelty. When they rode into town one morning for flour, thread, and a saw blade, eyes followed them as always. Whispers cut through the market air, some sharp with malice, others dulled with pity. Clay kept his shoulders straight, his stride steady, but he felt each gaze like a weight pressing against them. At the blacksmith's stall, one man muttered something low and mocking, his grin aimed not at Clay, but at her. Without raising his voice, Clay stepped close enough that the man faltered. "She's not yours to look at," he said, and the words carried such iron that the laughter died on the spot. She did not flinch, did not lower her eyes. Instead, she walked forward with quiet strength, her steps deliberate, her chin lifted. On the wagon ride home, she sat in silence, the market dust clinging to her skirt, until finally she whispered, "You weren't afraid?" Clay kept his eyes on the road. "I've been afraid before, but not of them. Not anymore." She turned toward him, her gaze steady, and slid her hand into his. They rode the rest of the way with fingers intertwined, the silence between them full and certain. Back on the farm, peace returned slowly, like breath after a storm. She sewed by the window, the rhythm of the needle steady, while he mended the fence or sharpened tools. Sometimes he caught himself simply watching her, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips curved slightly when the thread pulled through clean. He realized with a quiet ache that she was no longer a guest in his house. She was the heart of it. One evening, the sky turned grey with an approaching storm, and lightning flared beyond the hills. The wind screamed against the porch, and the barn door banged loose. Clay rushed to secure it, but sparks of fire caught in the hay. The flames licked upward, fierce and sudden. She ran for water without being asked, skirts gathered, bare feet pounding the earth. Together they fought, bucket after bucket, his arms blackened with soot, her braid unravelling as smoke curled around them. When at last the fire hissed into dying embers, they stood panting in the wet ash, their clothes clinging to their bodies, their hands smeared black. She stepped into him then, pressing her chest against his, arms circling his shoulders. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time their embrace carried not only survival, but desire, the raw certainty of two people who had chosen not to run. After that night, something shifted in how they moved around each other. She no longer touched his hand in passing. She held it, long and sure. He no longer avoided the pull of her eyes. He met them, steady and unashamed. When she laughed, it was freer. When she wept in her dreams, she allowed herself to lean into his chest until the tremors faded. Healing was no longer only silence. It was closeness, warmth, belonging. As the weeks passed, the house filled with signs of their life together. 2 bowls left drying by the sink. A woven cloth she nailed above the door. Marks carved into the porch rail, his, hers, side by side. At dusk they walked the rows together, her hand brushing his arm, his shoulder brushing hers. Once, as the stars kindled overhead, she said quietly, "I never thought I'd stay anywhere this long again." Clay turned to her, his voice rough with truth. "I never thought I'd feel alive again." She touched his cheek then, her fingers trembling but sure, and kissed him with the weight of everything they had survived. The fields stretched wide around them, the sky endless, the soil fertile with more than crops. Their love had rooted itself deep, not through sudden passion, but through the steady courage of choosing each other again and again. And as summer burned bright and fierce, both of them knew that whatever storms still waited, they no longer faced them alone. And when the nights grew quieter, when the lanterns burned low, when the silence of the farm wrapped around them like a quilt, they held one another with the tender certainty that healing had come. Not in grand gestures, but in the simple, deliberate act of staying. The turning of the seasons brought change so softly that it seemed almost invisible. Yet one morning, when Clay opened the door to the yard, he realized the silence was no longer the same silence he had once endured. It was alive now, woven with the sounds of her moving through the rooms, the clink of dishes she had washed and stacked neatly on the shelf, the low hum of a tune she carried without knowing it reached him. The house was no longer a place of ghosts. It had become a home again. The cradle he had built sat near the hearth, carved with symbols that were partly hers, partly his. She traced them each evening, as though grounding herself in the truth that this place, once barren of warmth, now carried the promise of life. Sometimes he found her standing barefoot at the edge of the porch, her hand resting on her belly, her face turned toward the horizon, as if she could see a future unfolding just beyond the hills. When he stepped behind her, his hand covering hers, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The healing had already begun, not only in their hearts, but in the generations yet to come. Town life no longer pressed so heavily against them. When they returned for supplies, people stared as they always had, but she no longer shrank beneath their gaze. She walked beside Clay with her head high, her steps measured and calm. When someone whispered too loudly or looked too long, Clay's hand found hers, and that was answer enough. She was no longer something to be claimed or pitied. She was a woman who belonged not because anyone allowed it, but because she chose it. That choice was the heart of her strength. That choice was the heart of their love. On the farm, they worked as though their souls were stitched into the soil. She carried buckets of water, tied vines, and planted seeds with the same care she had once guarded her stone. Clay hammered posts, split wood, and cut hay with a steadiness that carried more than muscle. It carried purpose. At midday, when the sun pressed down hard, they sat together under the cottonwood, sharing bread and cider, their hands brushing without hesitation. Even in silence, their hearts spoke. They had both known loss, grief, and hunger, yet now they shared not emptiness, but abundance. Their healing had become daily bread. One evening, as the sky bled into shades of rose and violet, she asked him, "Do you still carry the ring?" He looked at her, the weight of memory heavy, but no longer unbearable. "No," he said softly. "I carry you now." Her eyes glistened, and in the quiet that followed, she leaned into him, her lips finding his in a kiss that carried no desperation, only the steady certainty of love chosen freely. Seasons moved again, the cycle of planting and harvest repeating, but nothing felt the same as before. Each fence mended, each meal shared, each night by the fire became part of a story larger than either of them alone. Sometimes she would whisper pieces of her past, songs her mother had sung, names of places she had walked, memories of faces she would never see again. He did not try to erase them. He listened, and in listening he honored them. And when she asked, trembling, if he thought she was broken, he answered with all the quiet strength in him, "No, you are whole. You are alive. You are mine, and I am yours." Her tears fell then, not of despair, but of release, each drop another thread of healing woven into the fabric of their shared life. On nights when storms rolled across the land, rattling the windows and shaking the roof, they did not sit apart. They sat together, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand covering hers. The storms did not frighten her as they once had. The darkness no longer stole her breath. For now she knew that no matter what wind or fire or shadow came, she had a place where she could stand and not be moved. She had him. And he, who had thought his heart buried in the grave of another, had found that love could rise again, not the same love as before, but a new one, no less true, no less fierce, no less eternal. The porch bore their marks carved deep into the wood, mountains, rivers, fire, and lines that told of belonging. The sign at the gate carried his name, and beside it her hand had left her own. Together they built something that was neither only his nor only hers, but wholly theirs. The house, the land, the life they shaped. It was all a testament to the simple, sacred act of staying. And so, as the years stretched before them, they stood side by side at the edge of their fields, the horizon wide and golden, the earth beneath them rich with both memory and promise. Their scars had not vanished, but they had become part of the strength that bound them. Love had not erased pain, but it had transformed it, turned it into soil from which something beautiful had grown. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. They were home. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the warmth of love's quiet healing in these words, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if you wish to walk with me through more journeys of love, resilience, and belonging, please like this story, subscribe for the next chapters, and let this growing circle of hearts remind you, even after the harshest winters, love can bloom again.